All right, very good. Okay, welcome everyone. So my name is Brian J. Griffith, and I'll be the host of today's virtual book talk event. I am the inaugural Eugen and Jacqueline Weber postdoctoral scholar in European history at UC Los Angeles during the academic years 2020 to 2022. And this book talk is the first of a series of book talks that I'll be hosting in conjunction with a course that I'm currently teaching here at UCLA, which is titled Interwar Crisis, Europe 1918 to 1939. So in one way or another, each of the books that fall into this series impinge upon this period of Europe's history. Our next virtual book talk event will be taking place on Friday, May 2nd from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And that one will focus on Stephen Bittner's recently published monograph, Whites and Reds, A History of Wine in the Lands of Tsar and Commissar, published by Oxford University Press. So if you'd like to see the list of the remaining book talks, take a look at the book talks subpage on my course website, which I'm gonna link to here in the chat dialogue. And you can find the list of the books themselves, the authors, and also the registration portals for each of those remaining book talks. I'd also like to acknowledge this series co-sponsor, which is UCLA's Center for European and Russian Studies. In addition to co-sponsoring this book talk series, the center coordinates its own schedule of sponsored research presentations during UCLA's academic year, pertaining to the interdisciplinary study of Europe. So to get a better idea of the kind of previous and upcoming sponsored events and talks at the center, you can take a look at their UCLA website, or you can find them on Facebook and Twitter under the handle UCLA CERS. And so I'm going to put that handle in here. You can find them on both platforms under that username. All right, so I'm going to explain a little bit about the format and procedures for this meeting now. So I'm going to begin by providing an introduction for today's speaker, who is, of course, Dr. Dominique Kirchner Reill, which will be followed by about a 30-minute or so presentation on her recently published book, which of course is the subject of this meeting, the Fiume Crisis. After Dr. Reill's presentation, we'll make some time for Q&A during the remaining half an hour or so. If you're joining us here on Zoom, please feel free to use the chat dialogue to submit your questions or comments. I will be taking them in the order in which they're submitted there following Dominique's presentation. If you submit your entire question, just kind of pre-written out in the chat dialogue, I will take that as your desire for me to read it for you. So I'll read it out loud on your behalf. However, if you would rather turn on your video and your camera and your microphone and ask your question yourself, please just indicate your desire to do so in the chat dialogue, and I'll call on you in the proper order. If you're joining us on Facebook Live right now or on Twitter, so if you haven't registered for this event, but you're nonetheless watching the live stream of this event, you can use the chat dialogues, the comment or reply dialogues on those two platforms. And I'll do my very best with my 3-monitor setup here to monitor your activity. And near the end, if there's time, I'll bring in some of those questions as well. All right, so finally, as a courtesy to our speaker and to the other attendees, I'd like to kindly request that you mute your microphones for the time being until it's your turn to speak. All right, we've been about a year into the pandemic and into Zoom events by this time, so I think most of us have a pretty good handle on Zoom etiquette. Okay, so I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who of course is Dr. Dominique Kirchner Reill. So Dr. Reill is a social, cultural, and intellectual historian of Southern Europe, with a special emphasis on the lands of what are today's Italy and Croatia. Dominique earned her doctorate in modern European history at Columbia University in 2007, and shortly thereafter served as a visiting professor at New York University's Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. Dr. Reill is currently an associate professor of modern European history at University of Miami. So Dominique has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, grants, awards, and various professional honors, including, but by no means limited to, I've just kind of cherry-picked from the very long list on her CV, a Fulbright-Hays doctoral dissertation research fellowship in 2003-2004, a Rome Prize in Modern Italian Studies at the American Academy in Rome, 2012 to 2013, an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship in East European Studies in 2013. And most recently, she served as a visiting research fellow at the European University Institute in Fiesole, Italy, just up the hill from Firenze. Between last year and this year, she just recently came back. Dominique's research has appeared in many prestigious journals and edited volumes, including essays in the Journal of Modern History, Memoria e Ricerca, Slavic Review, and California Italian Studies, among many other journals and publications. Dr. Reill is also the author of 2 published monographs, including her first monograph, Nationalists Who Feared the Nation, Adriatic Multinationalism in Habsburg, Dalmatia, Trieste, and Venice, published by Stanford University Press in 2012. And the subject of today's meeting, the Fiume Crisis, Life in the Wake of the Habsburg Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2020. If you haven't already purchased a copy of this book, you can do so via the following URL, which is provided by Harvard University Press and is offering a 20% discount on your purchase if you use this particular portal. There it is. All right. Dominique's current book-length research project focuses on the life and career of the quote-unquote Habsburg mayor of New York City, as she refers to him, and that of course was Fiorello LaGuardia. So perhaps maybe if there's time at the very end, we can work in an Adriatic reference perhaps to the new book project. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dominique Kirchner Reill.
Thank you. It's always so fun to hear these introductions. I always feel like I sound much more important than I am. I'm sure many people know that being invited to UCLA is a big deal for me. My father is, I think that there could be few people that love UCLA more than my father did. So I just kept on thinking how happy he would be and how hard his question would be after my talk, which he would raise his hand immediately. But anyways, UCLA's, family institution, much love, and it's really exciting to talk about this book that I've worked so hard on in a world that basically formed me. I think that I spent a large chunk of my childhood making weird coffee in his office while he was teaching, and we didn't have any daycare. So anyways, just to say, so fun to be, at least even just virtually, at UCLA. I'm just going to give a kind of a map of what this book tried to do, and how, just a little teaser of what's inside. But I think the only reason to do all these meetings is to have the Q&A. So I'm going to try and be fast and in no way pretend that I'm answering all the questions. I'd like to talk more about what people are specifically interested in. The book is called The Fiume Crisis, Life in the Wake of the Habsburg Empire, but actually the title should be reversed. The book is really about life in the wake of the Habsburg Empire, using the Fiume Crisis as a vehicle to telling it. And for those of you who don't know where Fiume Rijeka is, it's here, right here. So there's Venice, there's Trieste, it's here. It's in today's Croatia. Now, most people, if you're a modern Europeanist, you've probably heard the word Fiume. But if you're not, and it's okay, we like you guys too, you've probably never heard of it. And that's okay. I mean, it's not a very important place. Today it's the 3rd largest city in the Republic of Croatia. The Republic of Croatia is a very small country, and Fiume is ever diminishing in its size. So it's not a place that's gaining in importance. It's a place that's struggling, like so many Rust Belt cities are. So you probably don't know about Fiume because of this, the city itself. It is in the northeasternmost Adriatic port. It is a new city, though you can find a Roman arch here and there. Most of the city was built in the 19th century, so it's a very different city than most European cities. It is known in Italian as Fiume, which means river. It's known in Croatian as Rijeka, which means river. This is the river. This river is not an important river. Its actual name is Little River. And the reason why a town that is only actually important because of its Adriatic trade, right? So its sea trade is called river, is because this little river has served over centuries from the Romans to and not today, but until the 90s, no, until 1947, it served as an administrative border. So a very easy to traverse river that was in no way a geographical boundary was used as an administrative boundary for centuries. Initially in the Roman Empire, then by churches and where dioceses were, or bishoprics were, and then in terms of tax laws. The reason why Fiume becomes an important story in the 19th century, and especially after World War I, which is the topic of my book, After World War I, 1918 to 1921, is because they basically create a little Hong Kong of the Adriatic, which is Fiume. It's a semi-independent city-state under the Hungarian kingdom within the Habsburg monarchy. I mean, just think of how many different layers upon layers of this is. It's basically a haven city of global finance and participating in the boom of the Mediterranean, thanks to the Suez Canal and thanks to steamships being faster than ever, and thanks to immigration and thanks to lots of things. It is a late 19th, early 20th century city where over 60% of its population moved to the city in the 20 years before World War I. So it's really not, you need to get out of your head what most of us assume from European towns, that they have this very strong localism, that they have, kind of like the Knickerbocker thing in New York, where no one is a real Fiumean unless they've lived there for 3 generations. That's not what this town is before the war. It's a Hungarian-controlled boomtown Hong Kong on the Adriatic. And the reason why I call it Fiume instead of Rijeka is because I'm just talking mostly about that story, about that strange bubble place that actually becomes the smallest successor state of Europe after World War I. It becomes its own country. The town as a whole today includes both sides of the river. So Rijeka includes this area, which was at the time of World War I, Croatian controlled, and it was called, that town was called Sušak. And this part of the town, which is, the Fiume I'm talking about, today it's one city and it's known as Rijeka. So I'm just talking, the Fiume crisis is not the Rijeka crisis. It's about this strange, what do you do with Hong Kong on the Adriatic? Now, this is all great. And if you're a Habsburg historian, you might know a little bit about this, you might not. And if you're an Italian historian, you've heard about Fiume, but you actually probably know very little about this. But if you've heard Fiume at all, you probably know it because of this. You probably know it because of the Paris Peace Conference. At the Paris Peace Conference, the question of who's going to get Fiume, whether it's going to be the Kingdom of Italy, or it's going to be the newly forming Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes after the dissolution of the Habsburg monarchy, it becomes one of the key fights at the Paris Peace Conference and triggers the only walkout of any of the Great Four, of any of the winners, the ententes, that happened at the Paris Peace Conference. And it happened 2 weeks before the signing of the Versailles Treaty. So this town, and this 50,000 person town that was important, was the 9th largest industrial port in continental Europe. That's important. Money matters. But it also mattered because let alone putting a League of Nations together, how in the world are they going to create a world with no more wars if they can't even sit in a room together and sign the Versailles Treaty? So that this little town of 50,000 people could put the whole thing at risk is served, and you'll find it in any history, in a diplomatic history or international history of the Paris Peace Conference. You're going to find almost a chapter on this thing, if not a lot of it. So this is known in terms of big stories around the making of international global law and diplomacy. In Italian historiography and in modern European historiography, it's known maybe even more because of this thing, D'Annunzio. This bald guy here was the most famous living Italian before World War I and after World War I. He was famous not because he was born to he wasn't some Prince of Wales, and he wasn't rich. He was famous because he was decadent poet galore. He was the Oscar Wilde of Italy without being gay. And he wrote about sex, and he wrote about it with a glee of shocking people consistently. He also loved to live extraordinarily. He read Nietzsche and thought Nietzsche was talking to him, like good and evil, yeah, let's bring it. So before World War I, he's already a celebrity. He's in his 50s during the war, and he enlists, he volunteers. He's the oldest volunteer officer in the Italian army. And while the rest of Italy is arguing consistently about what World War I is, because it's not going very well at all, and it's making the state look pretty bad, this guy has decided that he is going to be the living PR campaign of the Italian war effort. And while everybody else is talking about corruption and brutality and all the losses and how this is a disaster for Italy, he's changing uniforms almost every week. One day he's in the trenches on the Alps. The other one, next day he's on a boat. Then he's on a plane. He's a G.I. Joe figure of the Italian war effort, and he's just so proud of it. And you know what people are really sick of is all the depressing stories. So he becomes the most popular Italian for people who were sick of being ashamed of their country and who didn't want to feel ashamed of their war. They wanted to be proud of their war. And he was that. He was literally, want to feel some pride? I'm your guy. So during the war, he's really famous. And any American who reads the newspaper has heard about this guy. So he's not just famous in Italy, he's famous everywhere because he's a media baby. He knows how to play the media. He's been doing it his whole life. He pretended to die when he was a teenager to sell his first book of poems better. The guy has been manipulating the media since the beginning. But how does he relate to Fiume, and why you might ever have heard about Fiume is because he decides, along with many others, that Fiume, a town he had visited one time for less than 48 hours, and a town that most Italians had never heard of before the end of the war, decides that it is the perfect symbol of the slovenly ineptitude of Italy's liberal politicians and the absolutely false power of the Woodrow Wilsons and the Lloyd George and the entire concept of the Paris Peace Conference. So he shows up in this red convertible Fiat, I cannot make this up, with 200 or 300 followers, walks their way to Fiume, which at this point is controlled by an inter-allied military situation, kind of like Vienna or Berlin after World War II, where there's American troops and British troops and French troops and Italian troops that are supposed to keep this entire territory up for grabs until the Paris diplomats decide what to do with it. He just walks right through. He gets stopped by the head Italian general, and the general says, "You can't come in here. This is an illegal activity." And he says, "What are you going to do? Shoot me?" And he does a Napoleon, the 100 Days. He pulls out all of his medals. He says, "Shoot me here." And guess what? Doesn't shoot him. Actually, the general's afraid that he might get shot by his soldiers if he shot D'Annunzio. So he walks in, takes over a town from basically the military embodiment of the Paris Peace Treaty to the sounds of church bells and ladies kissing him and wreaths being thrown at him, no shot fired. And begins this long process that lasts over 15 months of trying to force Italy to accept Fiume. And in the end, he loses. But it's this story of outside the state, the charismatic leader, the shoot me, I dare you. No one can stop him. So it's a great story, and any of us who teach interwar use it. It's hard to not use it. It's just too fun. Undergrads get bored. You're talking about steel or whatever. You're talking about like reparations payments. I mean, those words just put students to sleep already. So Fiume is just fun, right? It's just it's a crazy story, but it's used also because it means something. It's not just a crazy story. It actually it has some legs, and the reason why it has legs is about fascism. So bald guy on a balcony, women kissing, Wheatstone, obviously Mussolini, right? How can you not? But even more important, it's the legionnaires. It's the guys that follow the guy. That is what has fascinated historians of fascism, that are trying to see how World War I jumps into fascism so quickly. Remember Italy, 1922. So how so fast after World War I did one of the winning powers become fascist, right? Because Italy won, didn't lose. So they look at this, they look at paramilitarism. They look at this esprit de corps of the veterans or the current soldiers who somehow don't trust their state anymore and feel more energy, more political energy around working against the state instead of working within the state, and that they're the nation, not the state. The other part of this that historians of fascism can't not be interested in is this idea of the liberal state and nationalist activism being at cross purposes, right? The liberal state made the nation state. The story is supposed to be the Giolitis and the Crispis or any of these liberal politicians are making nation states in the 19th century. So what's going on here is the Fiume Crisis ends in Christmas 1920. Wars at Christmas time, they very melodramatic, is called the Christmas of Blood. Less than 50 people died, not that much blood, but D'Annunzio, he can't help himself. But it ends when the Italian state bombs the town of Fiume to force itself to stop calling itself Italian. So it's actually almost a pitched battle between the liberal state and nationalism about who decides what is in and out of the state. In this episode, today's episode of pre-fascism Fiume, the liberal state wins. But the lesson then goes immediately to thinking about the March on Rome. And why didn't the liberal state win then? What are the commonalities and differences of these two moments? And why did the March on Rome not fail the way the March on Fiume did? So I hope that you see what's going on in the historiography is that these two stories, which are a 3-year difference, and these are contemporaries, Mussolini and D'Annunzio, they hate each other, but they have the same base. I mean, they both are the darlings of the nationalists, but they don't have the same visions. Mussolini's a politician. He believes in politics. He believes in parties. He believes in government. D'Annunzio believes in that's the end of everything, right? Nietzsche. But they are actually doing similar things, and Mussolini does learn from D'Annunzio's example and replicates it. And many of his followers, D'Annunzio's followers, become Mussolini's followers later. The other reason why this story won't go away is because of something absolutely unbelievable. There is nothing I know of that Italian historians and Yugoslav or ex-Yugoslav historians agree on when it comes to the Adriatic. The one thing they do is D'Annunzio. Both of them see the D'Annunzio thing as a precursor to what Italian nationalism does in the Eastern Adriatic. The nationalization of Eastern Adriatic communities, and if you ask an ex-Yugoslav historian, the ethnic cleansing of the Eastern Adriatic. So when D'Annunzio comes into Fiume and everyone's kissing him and throwing wreaths, everyone's repeating, Fiume Italiana, Fiume Italiana. This is the most Italian of cities. Well, over half of the population does not identify itself as mother tongue Italian. And in this entire period, what the cause of Fiume is Italy. Even though a large chunk of its population, and then all the hinterlands, are not Italian, don't identify, explicitly refuse to identify themselves as Italian. So even just this whole story that this is an Italian story is considered as chapter 1, ethnic cleansing in the Adriatic. This is part of there is no history of the origins of fascism that doesn't mention Fiume and D'Annunzio. It does not exist. I dare someone to show me a book about Italian fascism that doesn't bring up Fiume and D'Annunzio. And it's also now entered into these global histories of the 20th century. Global histories have a tough time on their hands because they actually can't just be about London and Paris and Berlin and New York. So they actually have to include other parts of the world. And Fiume is one of the places getting included now because it seems like it fits really, really well with other big questions about paramilitarism, about populist nationalism, about anger movements. The two most famous that have come out recently are Robert Gevatz's The Vanquished, which talks about I love this, Why the First World War Failed to End. He has an entire chapter on Fiume, and it's really useful, paramilitarism, right? These soldiers that kind of, they've been the manpower of the state during the war, and they don't want to give up their role, and no one can force them to. And then Age of Empire, Pankaj Mishra, his entire introduction about the history of populist xenophobic demagoguery starts with Fiume. And he literally says, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and ISIS are legacies of this, of D'Annunzio and Fiume. I have some problems with all of this stuff. First of all, again, over half the town isn't Italian, and so what's going on here? But even more, I don't like this story because Fiume isn't really fascism to me. It's fun. It's known as the Woodstock of the post-war. It is a bubble state outside of states waiting for something to happen. And D'Annunzio is doing a bread and circus kind of thing to keep his followers happy, in which we got a lot of fun going on in Fiume. We've got these nudist aviator leaders of pirates that make these incredible stories. We've got cocaine flowing everywhere. We've got the futurists coming in and doing their thing. We've got, Toscanini comes, Guglielmo Marconi comes. Like, it almost becomes a who's who, like a Met Gala of cutting edgeness, and everybody's a little different. Some people are anarcho-syndicalists, others are royalists, others couldn't care less about politics. We've got some socialists in there. We've got a bunch of He-Man guys. We've got a lot going on. But the only thing that keeps everyone in there is that it's not liberalism, but it's also not violence. It's not fascism. Like, I don't want, and this is the most famous book about it, the Festa della Rivoluzione, the Revolution Festival, to be how we think about fascism and the origins of fascism. For me, the origins of fascism are about violence. And so, why is this not a story about violence? Why can't this be the origins of fascism if I think fascism is about violence? Well, there's not a lot of hurt in this history. Again, the beginning, there's no gunshots, there's kisses. And the end, the Christmas of blood, 50 people dead? What kind of Christmas of blood is that after World War I? And as Gerhard very, very rightly said, there's still war going on everywhere. So the fact this non-war is the origins of fascism story, it makes it all make fascism feel nicer. It makes fascism feel consensual. So here's your question. If there's not a lot of violence, why isn't there a lot of violence? Is it because it's consensual? Is it because Fiume is D'Annunzio and D'Annunzio is Fiume? Is it because, here's D'Annunzio, this is in Genova, not Fiume. Is it because he really did brainwash everyone and they're just gonna follow him? Are his speeches so hypnotic that it's something we just don't know how to fight against? And so the Fiume story isn't violence because it's true consensus. Well, that might work if you're following the followers of D'Annunzio, the guys who run away from home and jump on a Fiume bandwagon. But the majority of the people in the story are not those guys. At the beginning, it's 200 or 300 people that follow Fiume. They think, and I do not believe in numbers, especially around this time, because it's all propaganda. But let's just be generous. Let's assume these numbers are correct. The high point of the numbers they think is around Christmas 1919, so month 2 of the Fiume thing. And they think it's a couple thousand. A couple thousand's a lot, but this town is 50,000 people. And that's not counting the hinterland. That's not counting that other town that's like interdependent on it. That's just counting that little Hong Kong of the Adriatic. And of them, half of them refuse to identify themselves as mother tongue Italian. Now, multilingualism is common here, like all Habsburg towns. This Habsburg myth of multilingualism not only is omnipresent, it's also kind of true. But we got 13% Hungarian speakers, we got 26% Croatian speakers, 5% Slovene. This is a real Habsburg town. Also one that during the war, for those 4 years, was fighting against Italy. Also one that got bombed by Italy. So having D'Annunzio with his speeches and quoting Garibaldi and quoting Dante and talking about the Habsburg scum and how all creations are ape and we deserve our victory and Italy deserves to expand for all of its sacrifice during the war. Well, who's in the town? The people who were fighting against him. The people who have cousins and fathers and brothers in POW camps in Italy at precisely that moment. The people who lost family members and friends during the war, and the people who don't understand Dante. So how mesmerizing can these speeches be? Also, he's not a great speaker, but whatever, don't need to go there. So if charisma doesn't answer at all, and yet there's still not a lot of violence, why isn't there? This is what my book is trying to answer. Why isn't it the Freikorps in the Baltics? Why isn't it Macedonia? Why isn't it Ukraine? And the answer just can't be D'Annunzio's fault. These guys are scary guys. These guys want to be scary guys. They're not doing a lot of scary stuff. I'm doing some scary stuff, doing as much as they probably would want to do. But thinking that there's no violence because these jerks came into the town is just not tenable. So what my book tried to do was figure out why. And what I found, I didn't know what the answer was going to be. I was just trying to repopulate the city of Fiume with its own inhabitants instead of with the D'Annunzio guys. What would a history of Liberia be if we're only talking about the African Americans that come to Liberia? We need to tell a history of Liberia with Liberians. Same thing I tried to do with Fiume. What I found was something Charles Tilley probably would have liked. I found the pillars of the state. The state you're not supposed to see because it's actually quote unquote dissolved. The Habsburg Empire is still there, even though it's not there. Brought up, kept up, changed, manipulated, but keeping people more or less satiated enough to not revolt. We're in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution. We have the Hungarian Revolution going on simultaneously. We have the biennial also, the socialist workers' movements in Italy going on right there. We are surrounded by revolution. And yet this town filled with port workers that does have a illegal but very active socialist party isn't revolting. What's going on in this town? Not just when D'Annunzio gets there, but also before. There's a whole year before D'Annunzio gets there. We're still also not in revolt. So I looked at how are people getting satiated enough? And I asked that, and that's the majority of the book. The real book is chapter 2 through 5. So the introduction, it's a short introduction and a short conclusion, basically doing what I just did. Chapter 1, which is like, what are the Fiume stories we know, all under the assumption I know none of us know this, but I'm going to pretend we know it and tell them and say, why are they weird? So what I just did. But the real book is thinking in terms of what is money when the state that made the money disappeared. If the United States fell apart, please don't fall apart, but if the United States fell apart, what is $1 in California? Is it the same as it's going to be in Mississippi? Their economies are completely different. If you don't have a federal state keeping them all together and you have this money, how do they do this? Well, in Habsburg Europe, they all started stamping over the money. So Czechoslovak money would get a stamp, Fiume money would get a stamp, Serb-Croat Slovene money would get a stamp, and then once stamped, would have completely different values. So in a city that's a transport hub with railways going in and out and a port, and the entire reason it exists is for trade and being between all these places, how does this work? So I look at it that way. And why does Italian annexation seem like a promising idea? Again, this is also positing, thinking about Italy not as a buffoon failure state, but actually as a much more viable state than most of the rest of Europe at that time. And that there might be real reasons that a imperial global capitalist port town might want to be in Italy instead of a rural, agriculturally modeled with very little capital and no infrastructure yet, though they want it, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. I look at law. What is law if the Habsburg Empire is gone and almost everything is mentioning monarchies and kings and emperors when all of it is gone? What do they do? What do they keep going? What do they change? What do they add? They do all those things. I look at citizenship. What is citizenship when your empire is gone, or if in the American case, the federal state is gone? How do they decide who has rights? Who gets welfare? Big deal after World War I, when everyone's on ration cards and and we're in inflation cycles that require subsidies and all of this stuff. Who's in and who's out? When now the local gets to decide the state. And then the last section is on where are we in the world? How are we thinking about what we are, where we are? And all of this is about what does wanting to push, because the leadership of the town is trying to push for Italian annexation. Some of them are nationalists, other of them are just pragmatic, but they're also putting together rule books for themselves around all these issues so that if and when they get annexed to Italy, they will already be workable as a subunit within an Italy, the way they were a subunit in Hungary before, a continuation of this kind of layered autonomy within a state. How can we be the Hong Kong of the Adriatic in Italy the way we were the Hong Kong of the Adriatic in Hungary? The major argument of the book is that under the umbrella of political nationalism, and everything is expressed in terms of the nation politically. The word nation, these poor people, they must have just gotten headaches about how much they had to hear that stupid word. So it's everywhere. Nation is everywhere. There's something else going on in which the people left in the dissolved empire are doing all this day-to-day work of consolidating what they liked and cutting out the fat of what they didn't like from before these new nation states get made. The book is not about Fiume. I don't really care about Fiume. I mean, it's a perfectly nice place. I really recommend you go there. But, it took 10 years to write this book. I don't love Fiume that much. I love New York much more. So why did I do it? It's because it's the smallest successor state. This is not an urban history. This is not the history of Fiume, the town. This is about how do you make a state after empire. And I started writing, thinking about Poland and Yugoslavia the whole time. Because if it's this hard in Fiume, can you imagine Poland? Poland was Germany, Russia, and the Habsburg monarchy. 3 different law systems, 3 different currencies, everything different, educational system. And they had to make something new out of all of that. Yugoslavia is even more than 3. This was hard work. It took years of struggling to figure out how to make things work. And so my book is it's a process story of trying to figure out how to not lose everything and how to have some hopes of a normal life. I mean, most of these people aren't activists. Most of these people are fishmongers. So what's the work necessary to just keep on going? And what if we thought about all of post-imperial Europe that way, as a lot of requirements of transition to make a world. So anyways, this is what the book tried to do. I hope it succeeded. I worked really hard on it. I hope that it's a kind of a bridge book between different historiographies that have somehow found a way to not listen to each other. So it's trying to sit in lots of different camps. But I have heard myself talk about this book so much. I would much rather hear questions, talk with you guys, not talk anymore.
All right, well, thank you, Dominique, so much for that really stimulating presentation. I'd like to invite everyone in attendance, if you would like to ask Dominique a question or just post a comment or an observation, please feel free to do so in the chat dialogue now. Again, if you post your entire question, I will go ahead and read it on your behalf. Otherwise, you can just indicate yourself as interested in asking something on your own, and I'll invite you to come to the podium. All right, so it looks like Claudio Fogu is going to be our first question asker. So Claudio, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brian. Hi, Dominique, my God. And hi, Geoffrey and Paul. So many friends that I'm just seeing through this. And I'm so excited. And because I feel like Fiume is also part of my book and my story. And I'm really happy not to have read Dominique's book before, because you usually say, oh, if I had it, if I had her book, I don't think I would have written my chapter, so I would have failed miserably. But I do love the fact that I was inspired to write my chapter by Dominique's earlier work on Valusi, and about this kind of Adriatic imaginary, which I expand to become a kind of sort of larger entity as a Mediterranean imaginary. Of course, very connected to D'Annunzio, but I completely agree with Dominique on considering Fiume a much more interesting story than the prequel to fascism. And I love, you gave us so many wonderful definitions, but I wanted to ask you about this other, you do mention it, this festive kind of moment of creation, which actually I discovered in my research was not just D'Annunzio, but it was also observers on the liberal side. One of the enthusiasts about Fiume's experiment was the liberal Luigi Einaudi, who wrote 2 articles about Fiume, seeing Fiume and the crisis of Fiume as the foundation of the overcoming of nationality in the nation state. And then his ideas would be then taken back 30 years later in the Manifesto Ventotene for a United Europe. So I can see that Fiume was both what you're indicating, a kind of reshuffling of the nation state, but also a moment that was not Poland and was not Yugoslavia because its size and its port and its history of maritime commerce. And here, I'm just going to finish with just asking you, what did you see the role of the backers of the Fiume, the pirates of the Caribbean, so the pirates of the Mediterranean, the union of dock workers in Genoa, which was found fundamental with Giulietti in really supporting this. I'd really would love to hear a little more about also that specific, but in general about Fiume as a kind of also very stark, in incomplete, unfinished project.
Well, I mean, there's just so many things to say about that. How can you not be interested in the pirates? I mean, it's just too good. As you mentioned too, because there's a whole network of how do they figure out where the ships are that they're going to take over, and how do they man the crews with people that will be open to being taken over. These are pirates that are taking over ships, not without actually much violence either. It's all been already set up, right? I mean, people who don't know the story, it's a pretty amazing story. How I engage with that story is that you can only have that pirate story if those men aren't having to control the civil population of Fiume. So if the soldiers and the D'Annunzio followers actually don't have much work on their hands of keeping the population of the town in line, they have a lot more time on their hands for everything that Fiume is famous for. If Fiume had become pictures and media is so important for all of this. I mean, I think a lot of the pirate stories and when they kidnapped the Italian general for the horses, I mean, all these things that are going on is about keeping Fiume in the news as much as it is to actually get the horses or to get the ship. It's that Fiume only has legs the more it can keep on disrupting international politics. It can keep on disrupting Italian domestic politics. If there had been massacres in Fiume, if there had been riots of Croatians trying to push D'Annunzio out, if we had had armed combat with pictures of women in their peasant Croatian garb being, raped by legionnaires, and there were these stories, but they were kept under wrap. I don't think Fiume could have been for Italy what it was, which was this place where every month it seemed to represent a different thing. Was it going to be a regency? Is it going to have that crazy constitution? Is it going to be the anti-League of Nations? every month, D'Annunzio tried something else out. And Italy and Italians watched it and took from it the month they liked of the lesson. So for monarchists, Fiume was also very beloved because of calling it a regency and continuing to call itself in name of Vittorio Emanuele II. For anarcho-syndicalists, Fiume was a perfect example. For pan-European ideas, it was considered. You could read into the Fiume story whatever you wanted because there was a moment of each of those things. But it never was an Ireland. It never was, a suppression of local populations and all-out war, which Ireland is having at that exact same moment. So I think that my history in helps the Italian historiography around Fiume because it explained why didn't D'Annunzio's legionnaires have so many moments of violence that they had to be doing. And how could you keep on loving D'Annunzio so much? How could he seem like such a charismatic leader if you saw so more division? And there's a lot of censorship going on in the press, and the socialist press Avanti is publishing article after article saying what we know about Fiume is a lie. You know, that D'Annunzio is cut the telegraph lines for anyone who's against him, that people aren't allowed to, that this is all a propaganda campaign. So Italians are also, there are other sections of Italians that are being told what we see Fiume as is a military propaganda creation that we shouldn't believe. But just to answer your background question, Trieste and Fiume are usually seen as kind of twin cities in a frontier fascism kind of model of that this is the first making of fascism on the frontiers. I think that the Trieste story works a lot better than the Fiume story. And most of it because Trieste is almost immediately taken over by the Italian military, and Wilson says in December 1919, Italy can have Trieste. So it's not a bone of contention at the Paris Peace Conference. But most importantly, there is no corpus separatum. There is none of this semi-autonomous city-state thing. It used to be a Porto Franco, but it's not anymore. It's a city. And so Fiume is different because it's not a city. It's a state. So it's a silly little 50,000 person state, but what I'm looking at is how they make state. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Very good. Thank you so much. Next, we have Paul Lerner.
Ooh.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. And Dominique, and I'm not going to ask you the question I usually ask you, the question you may be expecting from me, because I've now been persuaded that it's most productive not to see this as the precursor to fascism. And yes, you've convinced me, and I owe an apology to a generation or two of students I've misled, but it's not my fault. I didn't have your work yet to disabuse me of this kind of myth. But my question's a little similar to Claudio's, but I want to push in a different direction because I've only read a little of the book so far, and what I'm wondering, it seems to me that this whole D'Annunzio episode is, more like a kind of artistic happening or a spectacle or performance piece of some sort, one with more kind of joy and gusto than actual serious political work. And, you made that point very clearly. So what I'm wondering is what the kind of ordinary, if there were such a thing as, ordinary residents, what they made of it, if they kind of just ignored it, and it would seem like a distraction from the day-to-day business of the real concerns about getting, food on the table and so forth. So if you could talk about that a little bit.
It's a great question. It's such a hard one to answer. So my first book was mostly based on the voices of people, right? So it was about letters and articles and publications and correspondences, and it was a history of a network of people. This book is almost no voices, but many, many names, many, many stories, but always seen through the archives of the state, right? Disrupting moments or watching how they're trying to change the state. Because I wanted to not have the elites be the Fumians. I didn't want the legionnaires to be the Fumians. I didn't want the elites to be the Fumians. Obviously, the elites have a lot to do with the story because they're the ones making the state. This is no democracy. But I don't know what people really think, right? I just know how they're acting. So it's kind of a sociological approach to trying to put people in, because if I go by what people are really thinking, the only sources I'm going to have are either the memoirs from afterwards or publications afterwards of what it meant. But so much happens after 1921 that, you know, how are you not writing about this after you know what happens with fascism? How does that not change how you tell this? Or when the Nazis come and they take over in 1943, and that's a big story. And then the Tito Italy battles of where it's going to be, and that's a big story. And then we have socialism, that's a big story. And then we have neoliberalism, it's a big story. So I don't know how much I can use the memoirs and the letters and that stuff that aren't from the time, and I have very little of everyday people. I have politicians, but they change what they say every month because everything keeps on changing. So what I do know is that no one, there's an excellent article that just came out in Italian that was looking at what Croatian activists were thinking about D'Annunzio while this was all going on. And what this historian Vanni D'Alessio says is they're kind of transfixed by him. No one can really understand if this is a joke or if this is new politics. Like going back to what Claudio said, people are theorizing around D'Annunzio. They're trying to figure out if this is a fluke or if this is the new, what's that, the new tone, the new strain of politics. Is this real or is this an accident? And there's a very famous Croatian novelist who wrote this book called La D'Annunziata. It's in Croatian, it's never been translated. Fascinating. And it's about how all of this is a lie, right? So that he's telling stories about, how D'Annunzio is saying one thing, and around the corner, there's a bunch of Croatians, black market selling tobacco or whatever. But the other thing that book is really interesting about is he quotes D'Annunzio almost like a stalker, like an interest in the rhetoric. And then there's a very famous memoir that was written in Italian about this time period where people started talking like D'Annunzio, like all of this flamboyant language. So I don't know what the answer is of what people thought. I do think, if you were thinking something like a Gramsci, there is this hegemony thing going on about who's in charge at that moment and what that does to culture and everyday things. Like there's a lot more sex happening in Fiume, not just by the legionnaires. And is that because that's what always happens after war? Or is that because, you've got a guy who's flamboyantly divorced his wife and writes about abortion being the duce of your world? I don't know. No one's really done that work yet, though, because they've been so interested in the legionnaires. Because it's just trying to understand those Italians from all over Italy who ran away from home or perhaps lost their pension because they left their military posts. Or why did they do? So there's been this kind of wanting to understand why they went and what it means what they do there about Italy that has kind of overwhelmed that question you just asked, which I think is just a fascinating one of what do people think about living this? I don't think we have that answer yet, but maybe people will start looking for it.
All right, very good. Thank you for that response. Next in the stack is Marla Stone. Marla?
Hi, everyone, and congratulations, Dominique.
Italianist.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my camera off because I'm in the Albany train station, and I will spare everyone that. But so, Dominique, I have two sort of thoughts, questions. The first one is this issue of, was it violent or not violent? How do we measure a metric of violence? And we know the fascists period of violence prior to the assumption of power, 3,000 people were killed. So on the one hand, you'd say, well, that's not very many. And, as you said, 50 is not very many. But for insurrectionary violence, how many do you need? The Capitol insurrection, 5 people were killed. So just, how do you measure that? And then my second question, because we all ask questions based on what we're interested in, was the Bolshevik Revolution a model in any way? Were they looking back to that and, you take the train station, you take, the radio tower or what have you? Was there any discussion of using that as a rubric?
For example, the 50 people, that's not D'Annunzio taking power. That's the Italian state taking power from D'Annunzio, right? So that's not how did D'Annunzio come to power. That's not the 50 people. That's the Italian state getting rid of D'Annunzio.
Okay.
So there's not a single person killed. D'Annunzio takes power. The British, French, Italian, because Italians are supposed to say no to this, and American troops just step aside, leave the barracks, and give them down. So it's not about trying to understand, and I agree with you. So one of the things I never really know what to do is the burning of cultural spaces, right? In Trieste, you know this very well, the very famous burning of Hotel Balkan, which is the kind of headquarters of Slovene and the socialist movement in Trieste, is always used in the chronology of the fascist gaining ground in the northeast. Well, in Fiume, they burned down socialism is pretty illegal in Hungary, unlike in Austria, and so they have these unified movements offices of workers of different trades, right? They can't all be one parties, but that building gets burned down. So, and it's very associated also with the creation of Slovene nationalist organizations and reading clubs. That is a kind of violence, right? That's very symbolic violence, and it's showing that no one's going to say no to us. Like, we're going to do this. So that there's scary stuff going on, but there's so much less than Trieste. So why? Because no one else is there. I mean, honestly, this is motley crews of men with guns in an urban center left to play. And it is pretty shocking to me that this doesn't turn into a nightmare. And it's not a dream, but my goodness, we know from so many other histories what it means to put in a town those decommissioned officers, those soldiers, in a nationalist battle over who owns the town. It's pretty incredible that this did not turn into something much worse.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
All right, thanks to the both of you. I think we have time for just one last question. So my apologies to Matthew, but we're going to go with Kevin Kenjar as our last question asker today.
Hi there. Thank you, Dominique, for a very interesting talk. Greetings from Rijeka. I am actually here. This is, of course, a fake backdrop, but I am living here. And I have a quick question. I just got a copy of your book and got to go through parts of it very, very quickly. And there was one thing that really fascinated me. And this was the proposed idea of this League of Fiume as a kind of anti-League of Nations. And going through it, seeing how the League wished to, include oppressed nations throughout the world living under colonialism. So Afghanistan, Mesopotamia, Ireland, etc. And a little closer to home.
Native Americans.
Exactly. Chinese in California, Blacks in the United States, Americans. And I'm really curious, was this actually part of an anti-colonial nationalist impulse within the state of Fiume? Or was it more of this kind of desire to be a thorn in the side of the emerging post-war order? And again, as you mentioned, an effort to stay in the news. So that's my question.
It's totally an effort to stay in the news. So at the exact same time that they're writing up this League of Nations thing, they expel hundreds of creations from the town for no other reason than what their last name sounds like. And there are three guys in charge of coming up with this idea of the anti-League of Nations, and they do all these fascinating studies of all the different parts of the world and where we see oppression. And they're right. They're almost creative. I mean, no one's actually written about this very well, but you can find this in the Vittoriale archive if you ever want to look this up. They're literally trying to create like almost an Enlightenment kind of dictionary of oppression, and it's like case studies. Uruguay, like they're literally writing about the whole world and different places but these are three guys that are told by D'Annunzio, come up with something, but this is in no way put into action in that own town, nor is it in any way given much gas, right? So it's kind of one of those fascinating moments, as I think if you're like me, I love this kind of stuff because it means, ooh, they're really interested in this idea. It's so fascinating that they're talking this way. So it makes you think about what that Wilsonian moment is, and maybe it is real, or maybe there is something about empire and colonies and oppression that is speaking to people, and that they know they're in a really, really mean world and they want to do something about it. Maybe that's true. But you know what, when you look at the archive, what you find out is about those three guys making that archive that are thinking that way. It doesn't have much to do with the Fiume story. It doesn't even have much to do with D'Annunzio. He has no problem with oppression. So it's one of those great things I would use if I ever use it, to say we can find traces of people all over the world worried about the same thing. And these guys are clearly amongst them, but that doesn't have a lot to do with D'Annunzio or what's happening in Fiume. So it would be useful for an intellectual history about sensitivities and wanting to create new visions of world order. But it's not much more than breaking into somebody's trunk and finding their letters. It's not about D'Annunzio and his regime in Fiume. It's about staying in the news.
Indeed. All right, thank you so much for all those questions. And I also want to remind everyone here in the chat that if you'd like to purchase a copy of this book at a 20% discount, Harvard University Press is offering us this special code that you can click on and get your copy today. Thank you to Dr. Dominique Kirchner Reill for your time today and for that very thought-provoking and stimulating presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended and for your participation in this book talk.
This was so fun. Thank you.
All right, everyone.
Bye, Jeffrey.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye,
ciao.
everyone. Bye, Dominique.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Bye.